Okay, 1983. 1983, and because we're coming up to Christmas, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. And now this is based on a book, Sir Lawrence van der Post's experiences as a prisoner of war by the Japanese in World War II. But his book isn't necessarily entirely... well, it's partially fictionalized himself. He moves things around. So, Nagisa Oshima directed it, and it's produced by Jeremy Thomas. But the Nagisa Oshima turns out to be quite an important part in the whole thing. Well, he's the director, obviously, but anyway, I'll explain. Major Jack Selliers, let's get to the actual story. Major Jack Selliers is played by some guy called David Bowie. Now, he's an Allied officer. Captain Yonoi is played by Ryuichi Sakamoto, who is another quite important contemporary musician. And he plays the Japanese prisoner of war camp commandant. Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence, who, the name of the film refers to, is played by Tom Conti. And he's another Allied officer. He's lived in Japan, so speaks fluent Japanese in the story. And Sergeant Genko Hara is played by Takeshi Kitano, and I'll explain who he is shortly. He plays the drill sergeant in the camp. Now, those are the four primary characters. Ryuichi Sakamoto, as well as acting one of the lead roles, he's the commander of the camp in the film. He also composed the music for the film. He's an established film score composer. He studied music composition originally and ethnomusicology. He formed the influential electronic band Yellow Magic Orchestra in 1978. Some of you may have heard of Yellow Magic Orchestra. They are very influential. When he was filming, he remembered David Bowie as, I'm quoting, straightforward and nice. But yes, Yellow Magic Orchestra are very influential in the electronic music scene. Not as influential as Kraftwerk, but somewhat as influential. And there's a link, which I won't go into today, between that and this film and the reason that this film exists. Nagisa Oshima, the director, he was considered a new wave director in Japan. Now, his films were quite often, his original older films, were quite often political and controversial. Films that would thematically expose bigotry and xenophobia within Japan and the Japanese way of thinking. He would intend to question social constraints and deconstruct political doctrines. So he was quite a rebel. Much of his work is highly experimental in terms of filmmaking practice and workflow. In other words, not standard at all. Many of his films by the 70s were considered obscene and nearly pornographic, but he disagreed with such evaluations. In one situation, he said, "Nothing expressed is obscene. What is obscene is what is hidden." Now, Bowie was amazed that Oshima would build an entire camp on Rarotonga Island, yet most of the camp was not shot on film. He said Oshima only shot bits at the corners. I'm quoting Bowie. He only shot bits at the corners. I kind of thought it was a waste, but when I saw the movie, it was just so potent. You could feel the camp there, quite definitely. Oshima shot the film without rushers, shipping the film off the island with no safety prints. Bowie said it was all going out of camera and down the post office and being wrapped up in brown paper and sent off to Japan. What Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence is, as a film, I think, in my opinion, is more important than what is in the film. It is a protest by Oshima against the institutional silence of a generation after the Second World War, effectively diminishing the entire episode and hardly acknowledging it, that the war even occurred, to the culture of Japan. Oshima actively challenged the victimhood that he saw in the psyche of his fellow Japanese. And now that I realise that, the whole film really falls into perspective. The premise of the film, within the prisoner of war camp on Java, is a confrontation between the Japanese who run the camp, particularly the two characters, the Allied prisoners, and particularly the two characters, as I say, the two camp people and the two Allied people. Captain Yonoi would have paid his way to become such a high rank, because that would have been typical in that situation, despite not fitting that rank in terms of behavioural power or leadership. He just came from a family that was able to afford to pay his way into that rank. That was common. Sergeant Hara is of a lower rank, yet is considerably more commanding and purposeful, and a lot more violent. He is played by Takeshi Kitano. Now, this is interesting. Takeshi Kitano really plays this very well, exceedingly violent, but until this film was mainly known in Japan as a television comedian. And you can look up Takeshi Kitano. His nickname is Beat Kitano. Yes, he's basically a comedian. The idea of the idea of surrender was not an honourable option to the Japanese, and they ignored the Geneva Convention because it really didn't align at all with Bushido, which is the way of the warrior, the regulations for samurai attitudes. Now, under the convention, and this kind of tells you why, under the convention, an enemy prisoner of war would have had an easier time than their own forces in the field, which to the Japanese was absurd. So they just didn't see the point. They just didn't see there's nothing in it for them. So in the end, though, Bushido, as the war played out, Bushido meant whatever each officer wanted it to mean. So there's a lot of real serious misbehaviour there. The bad treatment of prisoners was also partly a result of having far too many prisoners to care for. Many became malnourished. Typically the lower ranks, you could kind of tell what rank a person was by how malnourished they were. Bowie's character, Major Jack Cellier's behaviour was rebellious in indirect and internal ways. Not outwardly at all, but in his own head. And his refusal to respond as a victim intrigued Captain Yonoi in the film, to the extent that Yonoi over time considered him a match. But there's this scene, and a lot of people misinterpret this, there's this scene where Celliers kisses Yonoi, and it's not necessarily what it seems. The kissing is normally only done very much in private in Japan, and this act in front of Yonoi's own men effectively removed his power. So it's a very powerful thing for Bowie to do, and Yonoi sensed that, and he just didn't have any authority after that. Anyway, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. Where's my thing? Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, 1983.